Good morning. My name is Greg Mancios. I'm the director of the Murphy Institute, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to this morning's breakfast forum for what I think is going to be a very important event. The title of today's forum is Identity Politics, Key to New Coalitions and Radical Change. What an important topic, and what an incredible set of speakers we have with us today. I don't get the chance to introduce them today, so I just want to say how much I admire all of your work and how wonderful it is to have you all with us today. The Murphy Institute is sponsoring this forum in collaboration with 1199, United Healthcare Workers East. 1199, proud in the house here today, I think so. And Cornell's Worker Institute. All right. I want to thank both 1199 and Cornell for partnering with us. I also want to recognize the chair of our Labor Advisory Board and president of CWA Local 1180, Arthur Chiotis. And the dean of our school, John Mogalescu, dean of academic affairs and School of Professional Studies. Forgive me for not recognizing the other distinguished guests in the room. But I do want to thank Paula Finn, our associate director, and the staff of the Murphy Institute who worked so hard to put all this together. They do a great job, not only today, but always. As many of you know, the Murphy Institute does these events once a month. If you're not on our mailing list, be sure to get on it so we get to invite you back another time. A few words about this place. The Murphy Institute is part of the School of Professional Studies at the City University of New York, and we offer undergraduate and graduate degree programs in labor studies and in urban studies. Collaborate with unions and other units of the City University to offer an array of workforce development programs and career ladders for workers. And the third, we provide service to the labor and broader community. This being one of our activities, but we also publish a journal, New Labor Forum. We organize conferences, we conduct research, all kinds of ways to help the labor movement and community organizations. I think you all should know about here, but I don't have the time to tell you about them, except for one. Liberty to tell you about one, because I think it's particularly relevant today. We offer a scholarship program to promote diversity in the labor movement and in labor scholarship. The scholarship is supported with the generous contributions of unions, including 1199, I should point out, and a matching grant from the City University of New York. We award over $100,000, over $200,000 a year to young activists who want to become either union leaders or labor scholars. Their awards are from $20,000 to $30,000 each. It's not chump change, and it's a credit to the participants who donate funds to this scholarship and to those who are selected. We had our first class enter this year. We'll have our enter in June. So I want you to please be aware of that. There is material sheets. If you know of worthy applicants, please let them know. It's a great opportunity. And if you have some extra money in your treasury, we'll take that too. Please check out the information or any of the staff for more information about the Murphy Institute. Let me then move on to our special guest today. I want to tell you a little bit about New York City's First Lady. who we are so honored to have with us today. Ms. McCrae was born in Springfield, Massachusetts, and graduated from Wesley College. Wesley. Notice how New Yorkers, not only, if it's not New York, you can't pronounce it, and you skip right over it. We already have you. And she moved back to New York, the important part, in 1977. All right? She began working at Red Book magazine as an editor and a marketing research analyst. Her deep commitment to social justice eventually led her to the nonprofit world, where she quickly realized that every organization she worked with government support to achieve their missions. This inspired her to take a position with New York City Commission for Human Rights, where she could play a role in achieving long-term system change, which was her ultimate goal. Her work with the commission transitioned to a position writing speeches for Mayor David Dinkins. Ms. McCrae later served as speechwriter to State Controller Carl McCall and City Controller. She also worked on the communications team of Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn. There she coordinated media for medical center and ensured that communications reflected culturally sensitive messages designed to help people access critical health services. As, quote, the First Lady of New York City, Ms. McCrae has played a central role in the administration's successful effort to establish universal pre-K and after-school for all middle school students. She currently chairs the Mayor's Fund for to Advance New York City. The fund is to make sure that all New Yorkers have access to the programs and resources they need to achieve their full potential. The fund's work is focused on health, education, community empowerment, and social justice. As chair, Ms. McCrae brings leaders from both the private and the public sector together to support the Mayor de Blasio's progressive agenda. Okay, so that's the official bio. Let me say something that goes beyond her accomplishments as a writer and editor, communications professional, and political figure. She also happens to have a connection to our guest speaker, Barbara Smith, who she worked with in Boston with the Combahee River Collective, an organization founded in Boston in the 1970s that proved to be crucial to the development of contemporary black feminism and the concepts of identity and in terms of race, class, and heterosexual oppression. That's Ms. McCrae's connection to Barbara Smith. As for her connection to today's exploration of race, class, gender, and sexual identity, Ms. McCrae has devoted her life to these issues in the interest of helping to empower people living on the margins of society. So please join me in welcoming Shirlane McCrae to the podium.
Good morning.
Good morning, Shirlane.
Thank you, Greg. That was a wonderful introduction. And thank you to the Murphy Institute, the Worker Institute of Cornell University, and 1199 SCIU for putting this event together. And thank you, distinguished panelists, especially my good friend, Jerry Hudson, Alethia, all of you. This is fantastic. This is for me. To be together with you this morning. And what a pleasure it is to be here to honor and introduce Barbara Smith. I can't remember the exact year I met Barbara, but it was sometime in the mid-'70s while I was still a Wellesley College student. And this is my personal reflection. I heard there was a group of black women holding consciousness-raising groups, conscious meetings, I mean. And I was so astounded. This is 1995, say, right? Astounded that a group like this existed. And I was drawn, like a magnet, I was drawn to meet them. And I exaggerate when I say those meetings changed my life. Now, I was truly lucky. I had a great education and family that supported me, but there were so many things that people never talked about. And those meetings were essential to helping me figure out, back then, how I and people like me fit into the world. Daughter of immigrants, as a young gay woman, and as I would write later, a nappy-headed, no-haired, fat-lipped, big-bottomed black girl. I felt a lot of those things during my childhood and adult years, but mostly I felt alone. I really felt alone. And at those meetings, I finally got to experience what it means to fit in. I got to talk about my life with women who saw me and related to what I was saying. And I got to listen to women who all had stories that helped give me shape and form and context to my life. And no one, and I mean no one, was more brilliant than Barbara. When Barbara started talking, I felt like I had lifetimes of catching up to do. And that was because of her ability to make those personal to political connections that I had never heard anyone put into words. When Barbara shared her opinion on an issue, we could be assured that she had fully considered the political, psychological, historical, sociological, and philosophical implications. And I'm not lying about that. But no matter where she took the conversation, Barbara always brought it back home to where women live and work. Which brings me to the kitchen. As many of you might know, it's always said the kitchen is where women do their best thinking. Their best thinking, their best talking, it's where it all happens. And what better bonding experience is there than cooking together? And let me tell you, Barbara makes apple pie.
How American.
But as much as I love Barbara's apple pie, my favorite creation of Barbara's Table Women of Color Press, which she co-founded along with some of my other friends. And if it wasn't for Kitchen Table, a long list of absolutely essential books by women of color might have gone unpublished or undistributed. And that would truly be a tragedy. I can't imagine a world without the power of ideas and This Bridge Called My Back, or Audre Lorde's I Am Your Sister, or the power of poetry in A Comrade Is As Precious as a Rice Seedling. And who didn't love A House on Mango Street? So many wonderful, wonderful books and ideas. And thanks in large part to Barbara, I don't have to imagine that world. Now, I was surprised when I heard that Barbara had become a Common Council member in Albany. Anyone who has spent any time with Barbara knows tremendous focus and discipline, and there is no force in this world stronger than Barbara's principles. So what better place for her to show that change is possible than Albany? Sense. Barbara is focused on racial and social inequality for the Albany mayor's office. And I think that is one of her greatest contributions, of which there are many. Over the course of her long career, Barbara has shown people, certainly generations of that change is possible. Emphasize that. Change is possible if you make it. I can't wait to read Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around. And I know you all will have a lively discussion today. And I just thank you again for inviting me here.
Thank you so much, Charlene. We appreciate your comments. And I want to turn the program over to our moderator, Jones. I want to say a few words about her. She really was the inspiration for today's topic and for the book that we're going to talk about, and for bringing all of us here together. She, being co-organizer of this forum, I want to add she was a former senior staff here at Murphy before she moved on to, circuitously, to 1199, where she now serves as the Director of Education and Leadership Development. The book that she provides the context for today's forum. As the First Lady pointed out, it's Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, subtitled 40 Years of Movement Building with Barbara Smith. Alethia holds a PhD in political science from Yale University. She is the co-author of many articles, including Identity Politics, part of Related Text, published by the Murphy Institute's own New Labor Forum. It's a great article. Did I mention it was published by a great journal? You know, there are subscription cards on your seats here. All right, enough of this shameless marketing. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Alethia Jones.
Thank you, Greg.
Good morning, everyone. This is truly a wonderful honor and homecoming in some ways. Everything comes full circle to be here at the Murphy Institute and to be at 1199. When Barbara first approached me about doing this book, I was an assistant professor at SUNY Albany, and she approached me at a time when I had already made the decision that traditional academia was not quite the right fit for me. And this book was really a gift to work on. And I think it's a shame that within traditional academic circles, it's not one that would be considered tenurable as such. So clearly the right decision to work on this. When we started this project, we had no idea it would take as long as it took. And as the years went by, and clearly it was a labor of love for myself and my co-editor, Virginia Eubanks, my partner at the time, would say, "Why are you doing this? You're not getting paid." It's like hundreds of hours of reading and editing and phone calls and writing and the interviews. And I can only say it's such a gift to have been a part of this project. And I would do it all over again, and we would. Everyone we invited, Barbara invited to participate in the book, immediately said yes. And it just spoke so much to who you are and how much you are appreciated, respected, and loved. So with that, I just want to welcome Barbara, as well as welcome Ju-Young Kang and Jerry Hudson to the panel and to this conversation about identity politics as a key to coalition building. The format for today's conversation is we'll have opening remarks, first by Barbara. Then there will be remarks by Ju-Young, as well as Jerry Hudson, and I'll invite each of them, when they make their remarks, to start out by saying your relationship to Barbara and to the project. I believe that'd be better than my saying it for you at this particular juncture. Then after that first round of comments, we'll have the panelists respond to each other. I may have a question, but they may have questions for each other. And after we do that round of interaction, we will open up the floor to questions from the audience. Okay? In my experience, identity politics is something that has become defined and shaped by the right wing, which I believe is incredibly unfortunate. And it is such a gift to have one of the originators of the term identity politics with us today to explain sort of the true origins and birth from movement building politics. And as a young woman who arrived in this country from Jamaica at age 11, one of the things I found quite confounding and even confusing, particularly as I won scholarships to elite schools and went to college, was this notion of colorblindness as an aspiration for a society. It never quite made sense to me why a society would aspire to a visual defect. It seems much more important for us as human beings that we want to be seen as our full selves and to be accepted fully for who we are. And so it's in all of our colorfulness that we want to be seen, not an erasure of who we are. And truly working on this project, I did not have the consciousness raising groups in the late 80s and 90s when I was going to college, and certainly working on this project and meeting Barbara when she was an elected official was certainly part of healing, growth, and understanding of a particular way of being political in the world. So with that, I turn this over now to Barbara Smith.
Thank you so much, Alethia. And thank you, First Lady Shirlane McCrae. Thank you, George, and thank you to the Murphy Institute for hosting this wonderful event. And thanks to each of you for taking your morning to come on Friday the 13th to come and be a part of this dialogue. I'm so looking forward to it. I'm also looking forward to the dialogue among us as panelists. Now, Shirlane's introduction, the First Lady, AKA the First Lady, her introduction her introduction told you some great content of how we met and also the work that we were involved in the Combahee River Collective at the time, and also the work, which was the work of building black feminism. But just so you know, it was the 40th anniversary of Saturday Night Live a few weeks ago, right? Yeah. Needless to say, I was glued to the TV and I watched every single moment of it. And one of the things I told people afterwards, just so they knew, I said, one of the things we used to talk about in Combahee all the time was Saturday Night Live, because Saturday Night Live was starting right around the time that Combahee was. We would watch it religiously, and then we would do, I guess, what people now do on Twitter or whatever, just to talk about what we loved about it. We particularly loved John Belushi, the Blues Brothers, the King Tut, Steve. We loved it all, you know? And we would laugh our heads off. And I wanted people to know that, and I wanted you to know that, because there's often such a misinterpretation or misperception that people who are extremely serious about making radical political and social change don't have senses of humor, don't make apple pies, and other things. So I just wanted you to know that everything else that was said previously, all of that was true, but we were the kinds of young black women who had our kind of fingers on the zeitgeist at the time. We knew that Saturday Night Live was breaking, barriers. We felt included. You know what I'm saying? Because they were so completely wrong. So as I said, just so you know. So just to say a few words about identity politics, we do believe that the first statement of that term was in the Combahee River Collective Statement, which was written in 1977 and published in a book. We were requested to write something by a wonderful person who's familiar to many of you, Zila Eisenstein, who is a wonderful political scientist and activist. I met Zila through a mutual friend, and she knew about Combahee. She had met other members of the group, and she asked if we would write something for a book that she was working on, which was aptly titled Capitalist Patriarchy and the Case for Socialist Feminism. So that's where the Combahee River Collective statement was first published. Had she not asked us to do that, we might never have written it. And because of the focus of her book, we, of course, wanted to rise to the level of the analysis that brought about that focus and that title. And one of the things that I said last night when we had a wonderful get-together at 1199 is that people in Combahee came from a number of movements of the time. We had had experience in the Civil Rights Movement, and the Black Power movement, and the Black Panthers, and the anti-Vietnam War movement, and in the peace movement, the anti-Vietnam War. Maybe I already mentioned that, but we had experience in the most significant social movements of that period, and we brought that understanding to our attempts to begin to define and build Black feminism. And some of us also were very, very sophisticated socialists or Marxists. So that really, I think, distinguished our politics from that of a number of people in the mainstream women's movement. When we use the term identity politics, we coined it because we needed a base upon which to build a political analysis and practice. Until we asserted the need to do political work that took into account our specific experiences in relationship to all the systems of oppression, we could not really begin to move as Black women. So we did not come up with the term identity politics to exclude anybody. We actually came up with it to get ourselves included in a dialogue where we were not indeed included at the time. It was an intervention exclusion as opposed to an intervention to exclude others. Now, depending on where people are in their political consciousness, they can read it however they wanted to. And obviously the right wing, I don't know where they found identity politics. And I also, I'm not unconvinced that someone else coined the term to mean something entirely different. It's not so obscure that someone else could not have come up with it. But as I said, I don't know that there's any earlier use of the term than in the Combahee River Collective statement. At the time, black politics were defined by Black male experiences. Women's politics were defined by white women's experiences. Their LGBT, or at that time, gay, politics had not even been fully articulated. Stonewall happened right here, of course, in New York City in June of 1969, a mere few weeks after I graduated from college. And as I said, the closet was still, ironclad and completely damaging and dangerous to those who were forced to live hidden in that way. But as I said, none of these elements had ever been brought together in one place to talk about what does it mean and how does it feel to simultaneously be experiencing racism, sexism, class oppression, and homophobia. We wrote that statement in an early time. The term homophobia and heterosexism did not even exist. So if you read the first few sentences of the Combahee River Collective statement, you will see that we articulate it as we fight against heterosexual oppression, because we didn't have the words. The words didn't exist at that time. Being able to be politically, have political agency and political power and effectiveness from a standpoint, a position of including all the parts of who you are, makes it much more possible to build effective and genuine coalitions, because you're not leaving parts of yourself outside of the room. I was telling someone just a few days ago, because of the focus on the 50th anniversary of Selma, I think it was, well, a couple of things happened about, like, were there gay people? or they're LGBT people before a certain point. In my office at City Hall, we have a person who, although he had worked there prior to my having worked there, he hadn't worked there during my first year, and now he's back. And he likes to talk. He actually, well, I shouldn't say any more about him because I don't want you to figure out exactly who it is. But in any event, so I won't tell you, but he does have a good sense of humor, I'll say that. And just this week, he was saying, why are all the news people now on TV, why are they all gay? Now, I'm in my office, and I can hear everything he's saying, and a wonderful new coworker who does development, a very bright young woman, I heard her say, they always were. It's not that so many of them are now, it's just that now some of them are saying it. And so the thing is, he said, so Tom Brokaw was gay? So I'm listening to this and I'm laughing. And the thing is, he brings me into the conversation, even though I really didn't want to go there. You know, he brought me into the conversation. I said, well, I agree, with what, Rosemary said, and then we were just kind of off and running into the deep recesses of his mind, and then he asked me if I drank because we could go out and have a drink. I said, yeah, soda, water, whatever. Anyway, I'm sure that's going to happen. The other more serious time, though, when we were talking about the origins, was when we were talking about Selma, and I explained that there were people in the civil rights movement, like Barbara Deming, who she spent time in prison. She has a book called Prison Notes about spending time. I think it was definitely somewhere in Georgia. She was a white, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and peace activist who also was very, very involved in the civil rights movement and did not come out until the 1970s, when most of those kinds of classic civil rights intervention had changed into other forms of struggle. But the thing is, we've always been there. We just wanted to have a way of being authentic, being able to push not just our own agenda forward, but to embrace the various experiences, the various rights, various freedoms and injustices we need to address and also to change. So that's what we meant by identity politics. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. So I actually just wanted to keep sitting down. It's actually really hard to follow Barbara, and I wanted to hear some more stories, and now I know who the person in her office is. But my name's Ju Hyun. I'm with Police Reform, which is a citywide campaign working to end discriminatory and abusive policing in New York. Thank you. I slowly think. I think the first time I ever met you was probably in the early 90s or maybe late 80s, but early 90s, I think, at a event in New York City where Barbara was talking about some books. And then after that, I realized, oh, there's this thing called Kitchen Table Women of Color Press, which I can't emphasize enough what others have already said, which is that the fact that Kitchen Table Women of Color Press existed as the only women of color press in the United States, printing books by and for and from the voices of women of color, changed so many lives. Not only did it change lives, but it actually changed the entire framework in which many of us grew into movement work. And I can't speak for people preceding us, but we would not have been able to. It gave us voice. It also gave us a way to think about how each of our individual and community and collective struggles fit into a larger analysis. But in many ways, most importantly, it provided actual substantive and concrete analysis about material conditions that we were not finding anywhere. We weren't finding in a mainstream press. We weren't finding in other alternative press. And so that, in so many ways that I can't begin to articulate, I think, transformed not only whole fields of studies like women's studies or quote unquote ethnic studies, but it actually changed racial justice movements. It changed the way we do LGBT work. It changed the way in which we think about how to do work specifically with immigrants. And so again and again, I just can't name how much that particular press and how much work Barbara, in terms of leading that press, did with much sacrifice to herself in many ways. And so I don't know that people know this, but it was a labor of love, but it was a labor of love that we all benefited from. A second place that a second place where I intersected with Barbara, I think, was when I used to work with a group called the Audre Lorde Project, which still exists. It's an LGBT, queer, gender nonconforming, two-spirit organization of people of color organizing folks in the city. That's a lot of letters and acronyms. But basically, queer and trans people of color. And it was, at that time, in the mid-90s, probably the first of its kind, definitely in the city that was multiracial, but also around the country in terms of trying to do organizing that spoke specifically to the experience of, and priorities of queer and trans people of color. And for what that meant working on immigrant rights. It meant working on police brutality. It meant upholding and sure that there were women and trans leaders. And Barbara actually, when, how many of you remember when Amadou Diallo was killed in New York? So late 90s, 41 shots. It's a real tragedy that today 41 shots doesn't sound as shocking as it did back then. But 41 bullets at Amadou Diallo when he was killed in 99. And one of the tragedies that happened with that case legally is that officers were indicted, and then the trial, which should have happened in the Bronx, got moved to Albany because there were all sorts of legal shenanigans. So when it moved to Albany, that was a clear strategy to try to make sure that the street the direct action movement that was actually working on that at the time would not be able to follow. So the good thing was that many of us had contacts with folks in Albany. One of the first people we called was Barbara, actually, to say, can you help to make sure that we've got court presence there, and if we send folks up on these buses, can you help coordinate on the Albany end? So I'm naming that in part because Barbara was involved in so many different struggles, and she certainly said yes right away. And then, well, I'm going to move to other remarks because I think I could probably go on Barbara's stories for a very long time. But the remarks around identity politics that we were asked to also prepare, I think also speak to Barbara's influence. The only things I would add to what Barbara said around identity politics, I think, is I just want to continue to uplift the immense contribution of the Combahee River Collective. It wasn't just a statement, it was a complex structural analysis. And I think one of the things that gets missed when people talk about identity politics now a lot is the demographics. Certainly demographics is a part of it, but part of it is actually that not every gay person has the same experience in the world and analysis of what needs to happen. And so part of what the Combahee River Collective really gave us was a way to actually think about how do we be authentic to ourselves, but understand what our individual and community positions are in a whole structure and system. A whole structure and system of white supremacy, a whole structure and system of homophobia and transphobia, whole structure and system of ableism. So all of that, I think, in many ways helps us to actually understand and frame a different kind of movement work. And the work that happened and emerged in the 90s, in the mid-90s, and the early 90s, and into now, I think, has direct lineage from the interventions that the Combahee River Collective activists and people around them made in terms of trying to have a different kind of structural analysis to the world. So I'm going to share maybe two examples of how identity politics, if you think about it just demographically, doesn't work and actually works against social justice movements. One is, how many of you have heard of the case of Akai Gurley? So Kai Gurley was just walking down the stairs with a friend in the Pink Houses, one of the NYCHA housing, public housing in November, and was killed by Officer Peter Lang. Officer Peter Lang's partner was Sean Landau. They were both go after the bullet came out of the gun. They didn't even go to Kai's body to see if Akai was okay. They were doing other things, and rumors are whether or not they were texting union reps or whether or not something else was happening. But in any case, Akai was killed simply for walking down the steps, meaning there was no suspect that they were looking for. However you think that happened, or whatever happened, it's an unspeakable tragedy. And this is one case where I think identity politics, if we're not very conscious and principled, can be used against us. The officer who shot the gun, Peter Lang, is an Asian officer. So he's a Chinese officer, Chinese American. And there's actually some organizing within the Chinese community, in part because Peter Lang has been indicted by the Brooklyn DA's office on a number of counts. Now, there's a few lessons to learn from this. One is an indictment doesn't mean justice or accountability. We saw that with Amadou Diallo. There was an indictment, and the trial, there was actually full acquittal of officers. We saw the same thing with Sean Bell. We see it again and again. So indictment is just one step of a legal process. But secondly, there's amongst some folks within the Asian communities and other communities are saying, well, white officers are never indicted. And so what is going on here? That could be an observation. That's fine, but I think many of us within the Asian community would also say that's besides the point. The point is that Black and Latino New Yorkers in particular are being indiscriminately killed without any accountability from the NYPD or the justice system. And that part of our job in terms of this is to try to make sure that we understand that this isn't about targeting an Asian. This is about making sure that the system is accountable for killing unarmed Black and Latino New Yorkers, period. And that part of what that means, though, is that there's opportunism right now, because there was a pro-Peter Lang rally last weekend, actually, but it was organized by a white Republican who brought together some of his Chinese friends. And for us in the Asian community and the Chinese community, I'm not Chinese, but I'm also Asian, we have a responsibility to counter-organize. But we also need to understand that we will be used as a wedge if we don't actually get proactive around some of this. And organizations like HAVE, Organizing Asian Communities, DRUM, South Asian Organizing Center, are certainly being in terms of identity. A letter was sent to Governor Cuomo calling on Governor Cuomo to issue an executive order to create an immediate special prosecutor for all cases of police killings in the state of New York. This by family members of 18 New Yorkers who've been killed in the state of New York by police, where there was no justice in their cases. Most of the signers on this letter are mothers, and actually have often organized as mothers. And in many ways, the leadership of these women, in terms of really coming together, if there's an executive order, it will not actually benefit their individual cases, because it wouldn't be retroactive. But they've collectively come together because they have said, we don't want any other mother to go through what we went through. In the future, we want to prevent this kind of pain. And so for me, in many ways, this is another example of how actually what comes out of an analysis like Combahee River Collective is it's an opportunity to really uplift the specificity of individual people's experiences, but actually have a broader movement frame about how we support those experiences. And the last thing I want to say about that example is that it's incredibly important for us as Communities United for Police Reform and our member organizations to support the call of those mothers. But what that means is that we respect their decision-making around what's important, what has to be in this executive order. So what they've said is all killings, not just unarmed, because there's so many complications about what gets called unarmed. So part of it for us is also recognizing that I will never know what Constance Malcolm experiences on a daily basis, the mother of Marley Graham. But what I can do is I can try to be supportive of what she's articulated as one of the solutions to this moment. So I'm going to stop there and just say that I feel like this is a moment where we can use the learnings from Combahee River Collective and Barbara to really advance social justice work.
Two very tough acts to follow. There are enough of you in the room old enough to remember the moment when Combahee's statement was first made. But if you're not, let me try to pull it back into the room. we're in the mid to late 70s. All around us is a battle that's going on around the whole question of consciousness raising. Some of us had come out of the Panthers and a bunch of other things, and so there's a battle around a kind of revolutionary nationalism that some of us articulated. For the most part, when you thought about revolutionary politics at the time, and then I would have said I'm a revolutionary, and so when you thought about revolutionary politics, you hardly ever thought about black women. You thought about Marxism, you thought about class, you thought about a lot of different aspects of oppression, but hardly ever did you think about black women in this unique. Now, this was an odd thing if you think about it, because truth of the matter is, if you go back and look at a lot of the movements that most of us came out of, it's hard to imagine them without the presence of women. Really, really thoughtful, brave women. Me, Ella Baker was one of those women, right? You know, it was hard to think about my politics without Ella Baker, and yet we were much more likely to remember Enid Stokely. We thought about a whole lot of folk, right? You know, Bob Moses, but how seminal Ella really was to us was hardly ever kind of talked about or even appreciated. Completely essential to the world. Really was a way to, in some ways, come to almost a consciousness of what made it possible for us to be. It was an important statement that to this day I remember. So that's how I didn't meet her until last night. When Alethia gave me my first copy of the book, I thought, wow, this person, again, it was like one of those moments. This person had been a part of my life for 30-something years. Reading her work, reading her work, reading the work of Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press. I mean, go to my library, they're all over the place. It informed how I think about the world. It's interesting when you think about that statement about the way in which it gave us a way to think about the various fullness of our being, how it brought to consciousness both the class aspects of what we did. I mean, these were serious Marxist thinkers, right? It brought class into the room, it brought race into the room, it brought a whole set of gender politics into the room. It brought a way to talk about intersectionality, this language we now use effortlessly. That language was born in a collective and how it thought about the world. Now, for me, that's important because I later went on to organize a lot of my work inside of 1199. And when you think about 1199, you ever think about it as what it is really a place where a number of black and brown women did their work. They hardly, you think of Dennis Rivera, you think of George Gresham, you think of Leon Davis, but you hardly ever remember Doris Turner, you hardly ever remember a whole lot of other leaders that were important to 1199's existence. But there is no way, if you are living inside of 1199, that you can miss what it is. It is a unique way of doing unionism that could not but be if it were not for the fact that it was made by women. It has child care, it politicized those kinds of relationships before anybody else did. It has all kinds of things inside of it that you wouldn't find any place else. And I would submit to you that it's that way because of who made it. Leon Davis and all of the rest of them, I'm not trying to diminish them. They were wonderful human beings. Their contribution is incredible. But I want to remember my mother, right? My mother was a member of 1199. I learned to be in 1199 through them. And I would say the contributions we've made both to the politics of this city and to the politics of the country really is the politics of black and brown women. I think, and I'll end with this, I think that when you listen to the young people that are now, I guess they're being mostly talking about police accountability, but I would ask you to pay some real close attention to who they are. This is a new and progressive kind of identity politic. Black Lives Matter is affirming our humanity, right? In a world that essentially denies it all the time. It was interesting that when I got Alethia's book and reading Barbara's statements and all kinds of other stuff, I was also making a journey with those young people. I mean, a lot of Freedom Side and all of these young people and I would meet regularly, and I would remind them of Ella Baker, and I would remind them of all kinds of stuff. And they had taken this language of intersectionality. I mean, they use it all the time, you should know, but they don't use it within any sense of the history out of which this language came. And so it's like my great privilege along the way of saying, here's a book, here's something to read, right? You can give them the Statement of Combahee, but we could also give them this book. And so a bunch of them have this book. And I think some of them have used it to say something very special about the politics of this moment. And so, you know, I feel privileged to be in your presence.
All efforts like this are truly group efforts, so thank you to all the panelists. Thanks again to the Murphy Institute. Thanks to SUNY Press, thanks to 1199 and all the different ways in which folks have shown support. I want to mention Karen Judd is part of the Murphy Institute staff, who is our timekeeper. Okay, but you may, as we close out, and of course, Paula, who has been an incredibly partner through the years. Almost half of the interviews conducted for the book were conducted here at the Murphy, and it was just so wonderful to have that support. So what I'd like to do now is to find out if the panelists have any questions for each other or any additional statements they'd want to make. I've been invited as moderator to ask a question at this time, which I certainly could do, but I first wanted to check in with each of you to see if there are any questions from the web of experiences that you all bring. All right, so I'll actually ask a question by making a statement and inviting your responses, and then we'll open it up to the audience. think one of the gifts of working on this project was just a greater appreciation of the difference between being in an identity category, right? One can be labeled by others as fitting into a particular category versus having a political identity or politicized identity, right? So simply being a woman does not make one a feminist, right? That feminism really involves study, commitment, practice, and there are many varieties of feminism. And I really appreciate Julian's statement about the holding the specificity of individual experiences while embedding them within a larger movement frame, and right, having that be part of the organizing. So I have a question about coalition building and the role of whites, and particularly if there's a comment on what seems to be an increasing coalescing of whites who are claiming anti-racist organizing as part of their responsibility of how they're participating in the movement, and just wondering what's the role of white identity. I know my co-editor and good friend, Virginia Eubanks, this is something she struggled with in understanding her own activism as an anti-poverty activist. We attended the first U.S. Social Forum in Detroit together, and part of what became clear for her is that she couldn't quite understand or historically locate her own activism until she learned the history of white Southern anti-racists who had also been sort of erased from history. So that's just one example, but I want to invite a conversation about the difference between being an identity category and having a politicized identity, and speaking to where do whites fit in that narrative.
This is a question, is this microphone on? This is a question that has really, I will say the word, progressive and left movements in the United States ever since there were such things, and that means we're going back a number of centuries. What is the role of white people in a white supremacist society and country to bring about change? We're not asking people to be someone who they're not. One of the things that I tell young audiences when I speak on college and university campuses, which is generally where I do get asked to speak, is that you can't roll the tape backwards. You're here. You cannot, have a do-over as far as your identity, at least not during this incarnation. So given that that's the case, you need to figure out how to be someone who is a part of the solution in a way that's really positive. And I think my observations about our so-called post-racial period, which of course is is a farce and not true, but what's going on during this historical period, I think that when young people say it really doesn't make any difference to me who anybody is, they do associate with each other, interact with each other, fall in love with each other even, do work together, play together. They're very, very comfortable in each other's presences, unless, of course, they're part of that fraternity out at the University of Oklahoma. And we know that their names are legion. That's the one that got caught. I mean, that's all over the place. So we're not living in any ideal world. But for those young people who are indeed more enlightened and who are very comfortable around and with people who are different from themselves, it doesn't really become politically productive unless they understand the history and unless they understand privilege. So we're not asking somebody to be like us, please don't try to be the hippest white person, in the world, at least not near me. But the thing is that I think that, as a black person of my age group, I can just tell practically through non-verbal, subliminal feelings if somebody is indeed comfortable in my presence. And so that's one thing. That's a comfort level. And I really appreciate people who are comfortable. And one of the things, if I feel comfortable around white people, I will talk about racial issues as if they are not a part of the problem and that they are the perpetrators of same. Sometimes I get fooled and surprised, and they will get defensive. And I say, oh, well, the only reason I said that is because I thought you were, obviously I'm wrong, because, but I only talk about those kinds of issues if I think somebody is capable of taking it in. But as I said, unless we have historical grounding in the history of struggle and meaning, and also are able to figure out how to deploy privilege in ways that are positive for everyone, then we will continue to have these problems.
I'm still struggling with my response to that one.
I'd rather. Can you hear me? Okay. I think I want to respond. Well, I would agree with what Barbara said, and also I think part of the role is to make sure that how I just talked about the case of Peter Lang, the OMPD officer who killed Kai Gurley. I think the role of white people that would be a huge contribution right now is to organize amongst white folks in particular to uplift a real understanding and practice, which is not necessarily that broad, and not only amongst other white folks who already agree in that way, but actually organize additional folks thinking that way. And folks in this room like Amber Hollybow and other folks have done that, or Leslie Kagan. And so I think that's actually a crucial role to have to help other white folks understand how to actually practice anti-racism. But I also want to just name that one of the things about the Combahee River Collective that this brings up for me is that I think, and Barbara, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that one of the things that it said was that if black women were free, if black lesbians were free, then we would all be free. I mean, that's part of the message, meaning if we can unlock what's the centerpiece of interlocking oppression systems, then that benefits everybody. And I think that's actually part of the message of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was founded by 3 black women, 2 of them queer, 1 of them an immigrant. And that part of what that means is that when folks say Black Lives Matter, it's not meant to say only one type of Black life matters. And for those of us who are not black, part of what it does is it's not about excluding us. It's about actually understanding that if Black lives matter, that is a different world. That's not the world we live in right now, but that is a different world. And that's the world that we actually have to get to. That's the transformative change we want to see, because that's about actually changing systems of oppression up and down. So for me, in many ways, part of answering that question, I think, is for us to understand that when individual communities put out a particular analysis and a vision, it doesn't have to threaten those of us who are not in that community. That it's actually a way for us to think about the world differently and contribute to that movement building.
I think it's important to remember that in the struggle against capitalism, in the struggle against racism in this country, that there were white people who made real contributions to that. It's hard to think about the Southern movement without thinking about Anne Braden, what an important human being she was, what she brought into the room. It's hard for me to think about my own union without thinking about Leon. I mean, it's just, there he was, and they were a part. And that movement was in part always struggling with race and class all inside of itself. Not always well, right? Making mistakes all along the way. But and in the process, I think giving white identity an oppositional identity, too, giving it the possibility of being something that's oppositional and a part of affirming a world in which we're not colorblind. We, in fact, see the real fullness of all of the different kinds of humanity that we are. We don't have a language yet to sort of name the world that we're trying to create. Precisely because of the way in which our identities have been politicized in this country. I mean, blackness has been defined in an ugly way. That's why when Barbara and all of the rest of us say, no, 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 this is who we are, this is what it really means, it's also offering other people a possibility of saying that too. It's like, this is who we are. This is what we mean when we say we are Americans, when we say we are black, when we say we are white. So, for me, it's important that all along the way, when we were struggling in one way or another against one piece or structure of oppression, there were white people struggling with us. And I'm not sure what they would say about their identity, but at least it gave whiteness a possibility for me that was, more positive than the whiteness that I mostly struggled against.
Thank you for those really rich and full responses. So at this time, we'd like to open it up to the audience, and we will take a few questions at a time, and then the panelists can choose which questions they'll respond to. Yes.
I have to borrow somebody's mic in order to.
Okay.
What about the one at the podium? Oh.
No,
I've got a microphone. I've got a microphone,
Oh,
Karen.
no, these have cords, sorry.
Oh, there, okay.
Why don't we start with this? We'll just start with her.
First, I want to say thank you to everyone.
You can do the hand.
And please say your name. And
Okay, my name is Marion Lipschutz, and first I want to say thank you to everyone. I feel humbled and honored to be here. I'm about halfway through Barbara's book, and I cannot tell you what an amazing experience it is to read that book. This question is an amplification, I think, about what's been said about the role of white anti-racist struggle. And part of what I struggle with is what I would call the dialectic of privilege and not privileged, and how dialogues and coalitions for social change get complicated by that. I spend a lot of time on Facebook, and I see people being accused of engaging in oppression, sweepstakes, quote unquote. One of the things I'm very thankful to for Barbara is that in the feminist movement we talk about the power to. And Barbara had the courage in very difficult contexts to name anti-Semitism and to call that out. I certainly have white privilege, but I do not have Christian privilege in this country because I'm a Jewish woman. There are a lot of people who know the name Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but I wonder how many people know the name Ernestine Rose. She was a Jewish feminist and abolitionist at that time, and in a lot of contexts, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton gets credit, Ernestine Rose does not. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm very interested in your responses.
All right, thank you. Are there other questions from the floor? They would like to keep it brief. And
no, I'm not going to identify myself, sorry. Just thank you for being here. I would like to basically thank you. I have not read your book. I would probably most likely read it. My question, I have a comment to make first, then I'll go to the question.
okay, please be brief.
I will
Thank
be
you.
brief. Well, basically, it's like I just want to make a clear statement that I've been harassed by being called gay and lesbian, homosexual, just because I basically do not have a problem communicating and interacting with them, because I don't see a problem in that. But unfortunately for people who are calling me that, I am not, I never in my entire life have an experience with a gay person. My question is basically related to identity as concern illness, because I know you're addressing race and sexuality. There are two big illnesses, a taboo illness around the world. But since I live in New York City, I would like your opinion on that. One is HIV. I'll be done. You don't have, I'm not going to do anything. They are afraid of me in New York City. That's basically the problem. I'm not going to say anything bad. I'm just come here to just ask them questions since they're talking about, but I'm just extending it to the matter of HIV and people with mental illness. I would like you to comment. And as a matter of fact, these people are in more serious problem than the gay or black because they cannot even talk. They're so ashamed of their circumstance. Yeah. So as you talk about the black community, talking about police killing a black person, so how many times have you seen black men or elderly black women on the street, mentally ill, not being cared for?
Thank
Do
you.
these people's lives matter?
So thank you very much. So HIV and mental illness. Appreciate. Are there any other questions from the floor?
How are we going to answer all these questions?
We'll take one more and then I'll turn it over to the panel.
Hi, my name is Lucia Gomez. I run a nonprofit called La Fuente here in the city. I'm actually curious about the way in which the realities of immigrant New Yorkers and just like the realities of limited English proficiency, being able to break into these kinds of diverse cultures. I mean, we work with monolingual Spanish-speaking immigrants of very diverse generations, different ages, different experiences in their countries. And I'm just curious because, you know, we talk about diversity, but a lot of times many communities are excluded because of language capabilities, because of educational access. And I'm just curious how all that plays in or not, or doesn't play in and is not really part of the conversation, and yet that does seem to be a huge gap. And when we take surveys and when we take all these political analysis, there's a very different perspective, and we tend to call it conservative, but it's their reality, and if they're not brought into the conversation during these kinds of conversations, then we're kind of ignoring a huge reality in our communities.
Thank you. Thank you for naming that. Okay, so I'll turn it over to the panelists to respond.
I've never done a panel where there were several questions asked all at one time, and I had to pick. So if I sound confused, it's because I am a little bit. You know, the issue of marginalization kind of tie all three of the questions together. Marginalization as someone who has white skin privilege at the same time of not having Christian or perhaps class privilege. The second person who spoke about the invisibility and the shame associated with having HIV or being HIV positive, and then also having a mental illness and how much silence, stigma, and shame there is in relationship to that. And then the last speaker talked about the situation of immigrants and how it's difficult for them at times, depending upon their language and cultural language access and culture, to even be thought of and to join in. So that's what I see. Yeah, I didn't know if you wanted me to, bring those together. But as far as like dealing with privilege and simultaneously, that's what many people of color deal with all the time. Acknowledging privilege and deploying it, as I said, in ways that are going to make positive change, that's what the responsibility, just like the person, Edwin Ball, who wrote that wonderful book, Slaves in the Family. I heard him interviewed, I believe it was on Fresh Air, where the best interviews are. And he said, I don't consider myself to be responsible for slavery, but I do believe I need to be accountable. So that's, so that means that you don't personally have to have owned the slaves to know that you benefit in many ways from white supremacy and from racial privilege. It's always complicated, but at least with identity politics, we're able to bring out the various strands of our own experiences, and identity politics has created a context where we believe that all of that is legitimate. I just wanted to say, in relationship to immigrant rights, as a member of our Common Council, which it was not clear, is a city council in Albany, one of the pieces of legislation that I sponsored was an immigrant rights piece of legislation. Unfortunately, it was a resolution, which meant that it was only like advisory. It was not an ordinance that became law, but it did speak about language access. It did talk about profiling and advised our police department, for example, that they were not to ask people their immigration status just based upon how they appeared, how they were dressed, or their language. Some of that, has, not necessarily in the city of Albany, but some of that is becoming more mobilized in other places. But I was very happy to have been asked to do that. And I continue to have interactions with people whose major focus is upon dealing with issues that the immigrant community, and particularly the refugee community in Albany face. So that's just to say, even though I did not necessarily mention it previously, doesn't mean that it's something that I'm completely oblivious to and not aware of how very important it is. All lives, like all lives matter, does not erase Black Lives Matter. That's what we're trying to get.
Well, 1199 is a weird place. I mean, there are hardly any meetings in which you can have a conversation that doesn't bring in several different languages, right? You got to have translations for almost everything. There's an important, Spanish-speaking part of our union. There's an important, Chinese-speaking part of our community, Russian. I mean, it's all there, and in some ways you've got to kind of struggle. And if you go to any of our events, you know there's all these cultures that are almost always popping inside of it. I think, almost always suggests the importance of giving voice to difference. I mean, it's almost impossible to be in that context without appreciating the variety of different voices and struggling with yourself with trying to figure out, okay, how do I hear this, and what does it mean to, in some ways, battle to make sure that that's a piece of the conversation. So I appreciate on the whole question about immigrant rights. I mean, that's our union. It's full of immigrants coming from a variety of different places. This whole question of mental illness and stigma. That's a hard one, because in New York, somewhere in the mid-'70s, there was a real act of deinstitutionalization. And so all over the city, suddenly folks who had been locked up, and it probably is a good thing that they were no longer locked up, but they were thrown out without support systems anywhere. And so their presence was everywhere. Homelessness among the mentally disabled was a thing that some of us have kind of struggled with for a long while. I'm not sure what we do with it all now, but it is real important to try to figure out, how do we reverse what happened from the mid-'70s on? It's always been in the mind of some of the leaders of 1199 that we needed to somehow struggle. You don't want to go back to institutionalization, but on the other side of it, you really know homelessness among ill is a real problem in our society.
And also violence against.
And total violence against. So, I'll stop there.
I think what I want to add is maybe some examples to try to also get at this. So for, in terms of people who are limited English proficiency, immigrants primarily, as well as folks who are HIV positive or HIV affected, or people with cognitive or psychological disabilities or in different states of mental distress at different times. If we take one issue, one lens of policing, for example, I think part of our work needs to be to uplift the different experiences of what actually happens. So, examples would include, for me, looking at broken windows policing in New York City, which I would call basically the hyper-aggressive enforcement of really minor offenses. So stuff like having an open container of alcohol, or spitting on the sidewalk, or riding your bike on the sidewalk, and the racial disparity, but also other disparities of how that stuff gets enforced. And so one example would be, there was an older man in his 80s, an Asian man, Kang Wang, who was bloodied and beaten on a New York City street in Manhattan by police officers with the alleged offense of jaywalking. And this was last year in 2014. It got some media play, but some. And part of the issue was that he didn't communicate in English. There wasn't any communication with him, and so rather than communicating to him, first of all, I don't know that anybody should be arrested for jaywalking, but that's a whole other issue. Secondly, you can tell someone, hey, maybe come into the intersection. If he was even jaywalking, that's even contested. But part of what the way the NYPD has defended itself in that was, well, he shouldn't have been doing that, et cetera, with no consciousness of what it means actually to try to quote unquote enforce what the city calls quality of life offenses with such a diverse population in the city. Another example would be vendors. Immigrant vendors are constantly ticketed and targeted, and oftentimes for really either like being too many inches away from the sidewalk for where a cart might be, and even actually being falsely arrested oftentimes, even when they have licenses in moments. And so for us, I think part of what it means is to make sure that we've got a complex understanding of how policing and police abuse happens, because it impacts so many different communities. So I really appreciate the comment of not writing off communities, assuming that they're quote unquote conservative, which is basically a lazy way for us to not do our organizing, to not say, actually, we know that there's common cause in this, and let's figure out how to get to that common cause and put that out forward together. And another example would be, there was a Community Safety Act passed by the City Council in 2013, which was police accountability legislation that the council passed to end to take a step towards ending discriminatory policing. So it created an enforceable ban on discriminatory policing that included not only policing based on race, or profiling based on race, ethnicity, but also immigration status, gender identity, disability status, which includes HIV status. And so for all of us, I think it's important every time we think about an issue to figure out what are the different ways all of our communities are impacted, and uplift that into the conversation. I'm going to stop that.
I think I want to recognize on multilingual organizing, there seem to be two streams. So there's a self-conscious commitment to be multilingual and accessible in one's organizing. And that was very clear in Barbara's work. It was Kitchen Table Women of Color Press, right? So they brought a very internationalist perspective and the voices of different women of color. And in some of your organizing in Boston, particularly around the murders of Black women, the pamphlet that you wrote on behalf of the collective was translated into Spanish in 1979. So it's very much embedded in an international analysis that cut across different communities. But there's also the need for demanding those rights and that access as well, which can be very uncomfortable within organizations to force them to change, but also very, very necessary. So,
Amber has a question.
okay,
I
terrific.
wanna go to Amber.
Yes, Amber.
And do you need a microphone?
I don't.
But, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we're recording.
Good room.
My name's Amber Hollabaugh. And in a conversation about identity politics currently, I'd love your perspectives on how often it seems to me identity is used in an empty way. I can be out in my union, but it has no political traction to do queer work in a union context, or I can be identified as an immigrant or HIV positive, but it doesn't have a political engine behind the way that I think originally identity politics, Barbara, as it was being thought through, meant identity was critically important to understand complexity of who people are that participate in change. And so I'd love comment on how now identity seems to me to be something that's often both stated explicitly and has very little content to the meaning of identity and how it's moved forward.
I would go back to what I said a few minutes ago about needing to have an understanding of the historical trajectory of what that identity encompasses, as opposed to it just being a label. And then also, doing this work, nobody ever said that it was easy work to do, and Amber knows that very well. And it's been so nice to see people who I work decades, cumulatively probably more than 100 years. Ana Oliveira is sitting next to you, and then Leslie Kagan is back there, and there may be some other people who I haven't quite seen, yet, who've been, we've been in this for a long time, and it is really very difficult and challenging work to do. I think that that's why an organization like Combahee was so important, because it was a place where all parts of who we were, just as the First Lady said, where all parts of who we were welcome. That role model, that's role modeling for other kinds of entities and organizations that may not be quite in the same place around that inclusiveness. But it's like chipping away at it. I mean, it's just really hard to, I read, and maybe I shouldn't even say I'm going to say whose book it is, because you can find the book, and it is a really good book. But I read Roxane Gay's book, Bad Feminist, just recently, although it came out last year. And, I was fascinated, here's this black woman, I think a little tongue-in-cheek saying that she's a bad feminist, because she's obviously a very committed and serious feminist. She just doesn't adhere to all of the politically correct expectations and stereotypes, like saying that her favorite color is pink. I love that. If that's, we're really in good shape. But in any event, there were points, though, when I thought, gosh, I wish she knew she knew about that happened however many years in the past, she would probably not be quite as concerned or this is a gap or a problem. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, I read the book wishing I could be in direct dialogue, with her about some of the things that, like, there was a point when she was writing about reproductive rights and freedom, and I was thinking, I wonder, does she know about Jane? And Jane, of course, was the seemingly fearless, a group of women in Chicago who were doing quality, safe abortions before Roe v. Wade. So the thing is, as I said, it's just like knowing more about context. I really enjoyed reading her book.
Yes. Hi, I don't know. There's a mic coming. Okay. So for this morning, my husband is Dan North, who was the former editor of the 1199 News oriented publication, but to tell the truth, I work for the National Labor Relations Board. And I want to speak to you, Jerry. I'm a little concerned that when we talked about mental illness, you talked about disability. We're not all disabled. Okay. I just heard that. Some of us are managed, some of us function.
No,
okay. That's all I wanted to say.
It's not. I'm clear.
Yes, in the back.
Good morning, Marvin Holland, Transport Workers Union. I think my question is more for Drew. You mentioned the Republican organizing around this issue of policing with the Asian community. I think we have for me, the bigger problem has been white liberals or progressives coming into our community, kind of telling us what the issues are, and ignoring people who've been working for 10, 15, 20 years on these issues. And it's becoming an increasing problem. I would just like to get your comments on that. Thank you.
I would agree that's a huge problem. And I think to add to that, I think the part of what Marvin, I think that you raise is really the issue that there's so many leaders in this city who have been doing work on long-term issues. And part of the problem with white folks not organizing other white folks to be anti-racist and in talking is that there's not respect or acknowledgement of the leadership of leaders of color in different areas of work, every area of work. It's not just around policing, it's every area of work, leaders of color. And so, and it goes back to what Barbara was saying in terms of understanding the history of any community, whether it's a geographic community or a community based on some kind of identity, but that is it's gonna continue to be a problem. The part that gives me hope, though, is that our communities are self-organizing and self-organize. And as long as we are also actually recognizing each other's leadership and uplifting the leadership specifically of various neighborhoods, of various issues, I feel like we're going to find a way to combat that. But I think that what you raise is a really important issue. Thanks.
And I think there's a question in the back, and that'll be the last question.
Hi, my name is Dahlia Goldenberg. I'm working on a women's organizing project, and I wanted to ask, sure. And I wanted to ask if you think that more needs to be done, and if so, how, to get more women's interests and women of color leaders to the top levels of leadership and to the forefront of our progressive organizing community.
That yes. Undoubtedly needs to, yeah, that undoubtedly needs to happen. I can't really say how it would, because the resistance about women's leadership, the resistance toward women's leadership, and also the resistance toward the leadership of people who are living in poverty, people who are living in economically challenged circumstances, class, in other words, the leadership of people of color and of queer people. That's, you know, it's interesting how white male heterosexuals still, in most cases, get to decide. So that is a long struggle, but one we must continue. I do want to say something, one other thing about white, understanding white privilege and the proper role, or the useful, not proper, the useful role that white people can play. There are very few places in U.S. society where you can find any truth that is useful about what it means to be white in this society, mm-hmm. and how race and racism and white supremacy are played out in this society. It is no wonder, you know, that in 2015, within a few hours of the Selma commemoration, that you have these 20-something or even teenage fraternity members doing this racist song and thinking it's funny to invoke an image of a black person hanging from a tree. I mean, balefully ignorant, but also very wrong. You should be able to figure that out, like, now hanging from a tree, is that because they're hang gliding and their stuff gets caught up in the branches, or is it because this is domestic terrorism and everyone deserves to be able to live without fear of their lives? That's, you know, it's just very, very difficult to figure out where does one go for sound inspiration, mentoring, and information about what it means to be white in a racist and white supremacist country. This country, the system in this country, does everything possible to make sure that people do not get that insight and information. It is a calculated decision that, like out in, where's the state where they want to get rid of the AP American History test? I mean, that's a concerted effort because there's truth in the new curriculum. We got to get that smashed down. You know, closing down people of color, like Black studies in third world, you know, like studies programs and whatever, that was Arizona, I think, where they did that. People don't want people to know the truth, because if they do, they'd be very upset, and they might indeed turn their eye to those who really are creating the problems, AKA the ruling class, so. And we don't want to go there, so.
So if you want more of the truth that never hurts, which is the title of one of Barbara's books, I think Barbara's truth telling, I like to think of as childbirth, the pain of childbirth. It can be painful, but it's ultimately for a good cause and leads to something much better and more beautiful. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. We're at 11:30. Thank you, Barbara, Julian, and Jerry Hudson.
Jazz hands. Occupy hands.